instrument that's been almost 4 years in the making. It was the driving force was Tanner Lake, a UVM student who graduated in 2010, who designed it during the McNair program fellowship. I was the faculty supervisor, and I've been interested in ancient music as my area of research. And John Butterfield and Butterfield Lutes actually built the instrument, so we will all speak a bit. I'll start by talking about what kitharas are, and a little bit about their position in Greek society. Then Tanner will tell you about the sources he had for designing it and his design process. And then John will tell you about the building of it and the challenges of going from the drawings to the actual instrument. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions, answers. People can come and look at the instrument. If your hands are clean, you can play it. And that'll be that. So let's see here. That's the instrument in question, of course. This is one of the most famous representations of a Greek singer. It's a concert singer. It became the most prestigious performing instrument in Greek culture from the late 7th century onwards and up to the end of antiquity. Played with a plectrum, the fancy strap around the wrist, as you saw I had, and the fancy performing robes. It's that graduation gown as close as I can come. So, one of the things that I've been interested in the past 5 or 6 years here is the tradition of lyres in different parts of Greece, all the different regional strands of this tradition, from the Bronze Age, the age of Mycenaean palace civilization, down across the Dark Age until we get into the historical period, the 7th century, 6th century, tracking these different migrations of instruments alongside migrations of peoples. We won't go too much into that here, but around the late 7th century, we start to see a new kind of instrument, which we call the kithara. It's a subspecies of the larger category known as lyre, plura in Greek. So here's one of the earlier representations of hollow. It was, as I mentioned before, a prestigious instrument, so it was often made out of precious materials, or at least had precious adornments. This image is often interpreted as trying to represent ivory ornamental work. And in this little fancy doohickey, whatever we call it, Tanner will speak about problems surrounding what that piece is. But here it looks quite clearly to be some sort of an animal, a deer or something else. Sometimes they look like birds. So whether it's ornamental or functional, Tanner will talk about. Now it appears that this class of lyre, kithara, arose in the Eastern Greek world, especially around the isle of Lesbos, which was a center of American poetry at this time. Famous from Lesbos, of course, is Sappho. There's also Alcaeus, a famous kithara named Terpander. And we have literary evidence that relates to this, saying that the kithara was known in former times as Asiatic because it was played by the musicians of Lesbos, whose island faced Asia. And in this sense, Asia is not a generic word for all of the East, but a specific Western Anatolia, that is Western Turkey, what's now Turkey, a region there known as Aziwa from Hittite sources. So this was originally a very local term. So Asiatic kithara is coming from this sphere. And if you look at some of the other Anatolian and Hittite musical instrument representations, they have a flat bass the way this one does, and a few other features that may have contributed to how this instrument ended up looking, as opposed to these earlier ones that have round bases from the Bronze Age. So we have some reason to think that we can locate the time and place where it emerged. There was a vibrant Greek and Lydian musical symbiosis at this time, and it probably emerged from that. The first representations of this instrument, as I said, are in the late 7th century. We have a literary tradition that Kipion, a student of Terpander, brought the kithara to its standard shape. We know nothing else about him, but the fact that he's a student of Terpander lets us put him also roughly in the 7th century, late 7th century. So we can correlate base evidence with literary evidence and have some degree of confidence that this is when the instrument emerged and the place in which it did emerge. It was used not only in, yes?
Can you move that so that we can...
Yeah.
Okay.
I solo singing, although that was its most important, or maybe most visible professional function. It was also used in processional situations, as you see here. I can't really not block some of them. So here it's played in an arrangement known as sin aulia, combining lyres and harps. Panathenaic procession at Athens, 6th century. Okay, so I think Tanner and John will talk a little bit about the tuning mechanism, but we do have literary evidence about the use of leather strips with some of the animal fat still attached to it to grab the bar. And this is something you also see in East African lyres. And it's what we first did on this one, but it didn't work so well for us. Here you can see a fairly good representation of those kind of tuning strips across the crossbar. Here you see Heracles, it appears to be, before a performance, he appears to be tuning up. He seems to have his ear close to the strings. He has his right hand around the tuning collars. And Athena is watching, but maybe he's doing some special performance technique. Now, as far as the stringing goes, we know that in the early generations it had 7 strings as a standard number. Loads of literary evidence. It appears to have been a kind of magical number that you couldn't have more than 7, at least initially. There's interesting stories about musicians that tried to play with more than 7 strings at Sparta, and the authorities, the ephors, cut away the extra ones. But eventually, in the 5th century, with the modern movement represented by Euripides and others, more notes were needed for more chromatic pieces of music. As double oboes evolved into elaborate instruments playing chromatically, so too the kithara, its players added extra strings to get some of these other notes. There's a really interesting fragment from around 430 in which a poet, Ion of Chios, addresses his lyre, and he says, "Oh, 11-stringed lyre with a consonant crossroads of harmony." It's a much debated fragment, but that it has 11 strings seems fairly clear. It's just a happy coincidence that it has 11 rather than 10 or 12. If you're familiar with the famous scene in Spinal Tap, the answers go up to 11. So it's not a widely known fact that over 60 pieces of ancient Greek music survive with notation. It's collected into a handy volume. That's in my office. There's also a copy in the library if you're interested. One of the pieces that we played just now is this, so-called Song of Seychelos. It comes from a grave monument in Asia Minor, 1st century of the Common Era. You can see how the notation works. This is the poetic text, and then the notation symbols are placed above it. The notation is several variations on the Greek alphabet, as well as several abstract symbols. The notation gives us only the melodic line, but poetic texts in Greek and Latin have long and short syllable distinctions, and this lets us get a good approximation also of the rhythm. I won't go into this at all, but this is a modern reconstruction of the notation system. So here's the notation symbols. You go through a piece and you identify, you go through note by note until you narrow it down to only one key or tonos that has all those notes. And then you know what key you're in, and you know what the relationships between the notes are, and then you can convert it into modern notation. So there's the piece we just looked at and that you heard. And if you went through and you looked at the range of that piece and counted up all the individual notes, you'll see there's it's just an octave. So this is appropriate to the lyre in its fairly conservative 7, 8, or 9 string arrangement. This is the other piece that we performed. It also comes from the repertoire of a kithara who was active in the court of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. He was from Crete, but we have 5 pieces of his that contain musical notation. So one of the richer sources. Okay, now as far as technique, it seems that the basic way you can play it is as I did it, which is to double the melody note by note. And Plato talks about this as being the appropriate method of teaching young boys in their school. Music was one of their main subjects. So he recommends avoiding all the elaborations of professional musicians where you're playing several notes per melodic note, or you're doing high notes while the melody sings a low note, or a low note while the melody sings a high note. So just play the melody, keep it simple. Everything else is it's undignified for a gentleman. Let's just play the lyre. So I did that when I played it because I couldn't do any better. And that's all I could do so far, but conveniently enough. However, other sources give us a little more information on the fancier professional techniques. Quite how you interpret this is open to interpretation. But this passage from Quintilian mentions a few techniques. With your right hand, you sort of sweep over the strings with the plectrum. This is shown in all the vases. But the left hand can do various things. It can trabant, it can draw them. This maybe means pulling them out of the path of the plectrum. Continent means to contain or hold them down, which I take to mean dampen them. You put your fingers on them so that when you sweep them, they don't sound, or they give just a click. And praebant, to offer them. This probably means not to dampen them, but to let them be open and ring. I would assume that that's what that means. We'll see in a second a clip of an East African lyrist doing just that. This vase painting I put up because you might be able to construe it as damping and possibly plucking with the thumb, while the right hand is doing plectrum work. It's doing something. It's not, the hands are not just static. It's up to something. There's other things mentioned by Ptolemy in the harmonics, weaving upwards and downwards. This is probably alternating notes in an upward direction, like a Hanon exercise, or going downwards. Prolongation, perhaps legato. Supplementary picking, epipsalmos. The Greek verb salo means to pluck with the finger, as opposed to cruo, which means to strike with the plectrum. So this is probably what Ptolemy calls epipsalmos. And I think I won't go into this much, although I guess I'll just mention that there was a well-developed tradition of microtonal intervals in which you slightly adjusted the notes so that they resonated at natural intervals like 5 to 4 ratio, 6 to 5, and 7 to 6. And these are intervals we don't use in our music now, but they seem to have placed a lot of emphasis on them. So I just would like to close by playing you this clip of an actual lyre known as the kithara, etymologically related to kinnor in the Bible. So it's an East African development of the word kinnor. It's a West Semitic word. And it's a living tradition in East Africa and also coastal Saudi Arabia. And I want to show it to you because you can see with this guy very clearly the combination of strumming and damping, which must have been somewhat like what the Greeks did. Not exactly, but we have enough evidence to suggest that they did something analogous. So here we go. I hope sent off to John Butterfield, who would then recreate the instrument from the data that I had gathered. So an important thing, kind of one of the earliest things I had to deal with was what my sources were going to be. There are tons of like vase paintings, and there's some coins everywhere, there's some reliefs I could find. But those all kind of range several centuries apart. And like with anything, if you look at it, they had 1 century and the next couple centuries later, it's not necessarily going to be the same kind of snapshot. So after a little discussion with Professor William Mears, we decided to settle on the 5th century, specifically red figure attic vase, more or less. Because
because you've got mostly a whole lot of figures with the kithara relatively intact. And I mentioned arms dealing here because one of the most important things for while I was selecting sources was I needed to find a picture of not just the kithara, but also with some reference points. So I decided I would use the distance from some guy's elbow to his wrist as kind of a good reference point. I'd measure the wrist or the forearm distance, and then make all kinds of tiny measurements of the kithara itself. The other image over there is kind of a bad one, because you want to see his left hand and no forearm at all, so I couldn't really use that one even if it happened to be in the right kind of thing. The other thing I had to be careful of was whether or not the kithara was painted on the flat surface of the face, or whether it kind of continued up around this curve. And since I was working primarily with digital photos and I couldn't get out a tape measure wrapped around the curve, I would be losing kind of key information with that curve of the instrument around the base. So again, I would have to cut out certain parts or certain data sources that had an unfortunate curve capabilities. But once I had those problems out of the way, I was free to essentially construct a quick sketch for myself of all the different measurements I would need for any given picture. So I had like the total length of it at the bottom, the total height of it, width, depth, and whatnot of all these little tiny portion pieces, crossbar length, everything that I could really think of. I was going through and taking tiny measurements in millimeters on those bases. And then from there, I could use the data I gathered from the player's forearm to come up with a sort of proportion. So I would know what percentage of a player's forearm the, say, total height of the instrument was, or that one little horseshoe bit was. And here's just basically a huge old table of all that info. And from there, I could measure my own forearm and get a real-world measurement out of that, centimeters, inches, whatever, and take those proportions, and then do that math and convert the proportions, which I got from millimeters on the pictures, into actual usable measurements that we could then base the design off of and make something out of. Like John said, I am going to touch on this horseshoe construction right here. It's kind of a point of contention among other people who have done this reconstruction. This one guy, Bo Lar, when I was reading some of his work on his reconstruction, he suggested that it was kind of a springy sort of structure, so that the force of the strings pulling down across the would kind of make the instrument give a tiny bit, and that way you would have a little bit more of a resonance effect. But I wasn't entirely sure that was a good call, because if you look at the actual structure where this up here comes to meet, where you've got the force exerted by the strings on this crossbar being forced down into this arm. This little piece right here is pretty tiny, and I wasn't sure if that would be enough to really hold the And then we have these colipes, like tuning mechanisms. There's a picture of a guy in the boss kind of making this kind of motion with his hand as if he's turning these leather collars. Again, there's more evidence for the leather collars in this kind of dim black and white over here, where it just kind of looks like little round segments, possibly of leather, wrapped around the crossbar, that you would then line the string over and tune, which is, like we said, originally what we did for this instrument. We found it really difficult to tune. And there's other evidence, John mentioned literary evidence, of these little wooden pegs that you could wind the string in a kind of U fashion around the crossbar. And that gives you a lot more leverage to tune the instrument with, which is, I guess, what they did not too long ago. Another problem I had was getting a good view of the rear of the instrument. This face painting over here on the far right is kind of a weird, really wonky picture. Like half of it is done in like a side view, half of it's done kind of like a three-quarter profile. So that one obviously wasn't really good for taking measurements because it was kind of a non-reliable image. But over on the left, you see this coin, and it has a really good depiction that there's like a protrusion of the back of the instrument out into space. There's kind of a bump on top, and that I think gives a better sense of the hollowness, of the roundness of the body of the instrument itself. And in some of my drawings, this was kind of the top part of that kithara, the body of it. This kind of evolved into something a little more able to be worked with from John Butterfield's stance. But the idea of it is just kind of like a rounded domed cover on top, going into the rest of the body, where you've got like these slat-like arms on the back, kind of covering it in the same shape. But there's a lot of really good detail, at least for the front of the instrument. That was where most of my, where I got a lot of good information out of all of my base paintings. The front of the instrument was really detailed. You could see where the tailpiece was, you could see what the bridge was, how the arms kind of connected to the whole body of the instrument was remarkably easy for that part. Again, the faceplate and the base over here, again, demonstrating that there is a large kind of hollowness, a sort of resonating chamber to this kithara, which makes sense because it was made to be played for concerts. So you had to have enough oomph for everyone in the audience to hear. I think that's actually about most of the process. It was relatively straightforward aside from those problems I had. So I guess for now, turn things right over to John Butterfield.
Hi everybody, I'm John Butterfield from Seattle. I'd like to thank the Classics Department for inviting me out to be part of the presentation. I grew up in Connecticut, New Hampshire, so it's nice to visit this area again. So I'd like to briefly touch on the construction process and also talk a bit about some of the challenges I had along the way. So when I received the drawing from Tanner, you saw some details of that drawing. It was a rather large piece of paper showing the different components in sort of an exploded view and some different angles. I thought to myself, well, how do I start this enterprise? What's the first thing I want to do? And I decided to start with the soundboard. Now, I don't know if many of you are familiar with guitars. I'm sure most of us have seen a guitar, but the soundboard is very much like a guitar soundboard in that it's a book-matched piece of spruce. I'm not sure if you know what that is, but if you look, it's hard to see in this image, but if you look on the instrument, there's actually a glue joint running right down the center. We have two pieces of wood here. What book matching is, you can imagine a single piece of wood that is cut right down the middle and then opened up as if you have two pieces of bread, or with the book analogy, you're opening a book after you cut the two pieces like this. And these edges have to be jointed together. It's a little bit challenging to get it right. And if it's done properly, it's very hard to detect. And the reason why you would want to have a book-matched top is because every single piece of wood is going to differ slightly in its internal tension or its grain structure, even visual elements, the way the grain is running, or you might have some figuring in the grain. So aesthetically, it's nice to have the symmetry, and also you have the equal tension on both sides, so you'll have a consistent surface there. So that's what I started with, and so after joining the two pieces together, I thicknessed the soundboard to approximately 2 millimeters, and then with a sharp knife, I cut these notches out to fit what we're calling the lower arms here, these pieces of maple, and they were also thicknessed to the same depth as the soundboard. So that was the second thing I did. I decided to build the instrument face down, starting with the front of it. And so I added that. And as you can see here, this is an early picture of the process. I added the upper arms that Tanner was talking about. And as you'll be able to see if you look at the instrument, the lower portion of this upper arm is a little bit thicker. And the crossbar does have these rectangular slots so that it actually just slides right onto the slat-like pieces of the upper arms here. And the soundbar is then resting on this shoulder, the thicker portion of this piece of wood. And it's actually not glued at all. So what's happening is it's a pretty tight fit, first of all, but the string tension is just holding it in place. It is removable if you needed to do some kind of repair or modification. So that's just about the only piece of the instrument that isn't glued. The bridge is also not glued to the soundboard, I should add. And the tailpiece is just fitted without glue to the bottom of the instrument. But I wanted to mention quickly that the glue I'm using, it's kind of interesting. It's high glue. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but until about 100 years ago, this glue was the glue that was used for all types of woodworking for thousands of years, dating back before ancient Greece, actually. So it has a lot of advantages over modern adhesives. It does have some limitations. The glue has to be a certain temperature. You have a very short window to set the pieces together and plant them. But one great advantage, especially with instruments, is the joints are reversible because it's water-based adhesive. You could, if you needed to repair or touch up something, you just heat the area with some moisture, a little bit of water, and you can separate the pieces. It's not easy, but it can be done. By the way, it's really just like it's a collagen-based glue. It's made from animal hides and some other parts of like connective tissues and bones sometimes. So usually it's a hide glue, cattle hide. It's very much like very strong gelatin, if you think of it that way. Okay, so here's another early stage of the construction. And I wanted to mention right here, this was a design consideration I had to figure out early on. This is just on a flat surface. You can see that the front of the instrument is flat. And if we didn't have a picture of this, I had a slide, I took it out. But later harps in the Roman period had a very deep dish or concave front, almost like the profile of a snowplow, if you think of it that way. And I don't know if some of these Greek harps from this period had some kind of scoop or concave front. If I was to do that, I would have to build some kind of mold or form in order to construct the front of the instrument. I chose to do a flat front just because it does seem from the iconography that they are flat or very close to it. But that was one of the decisions I had to make early on. Did I want to go with the flat front? So that's what I chose to do. So another moment where I was scratching my head is, what do I do about the top of the body that Tanner had mentioned between the lower arms, where the lower arms are coming into contact with the body? There was this strange shape on the top of the body, almost like a manta ray, and I was, trying to figure out how I could construct that. And I chose to use a solid piece of wood, and not only that, but to extend the edges of this solid piece all the way to the outer edges of the upper body. And I thought that would really help strengthen the connection of the lower arms here and the body, the resonating body. So that was how I decided to solve that. So at this point, I added the sides, and if you look closely, probably it's easier to look at the instrument. They are slightly tapered. They're a little more narrow here compared to at the base. And also, if you look at the crossbar, it also has a slight taper towards the end, kind of like an architectural column. I just think it's more pleasing to the eye, and also the strength really needs to be at the midsection where the strings are pulling between the slats. So I slightly tapered that on the lathe. I turned that on the lathe. It's I don't know if you want me to discuss the different types of woods, but that's one which I turned on the lathe. Yeah, okay. If you guys want to ask me about the details, I can talk more about that later after the presentation. So I also added the bottom of the body at this point. Let me just next slide. So I'm sort of building the instrument up from the front surface. Whoops. Are they okay? Okay. Now here's that solid form. I'm continuing to remove some material from that, and you can kind of see my reference lines as I'm working. So in this picture, I wanted to point out one thing. The intersection or the joint of the upper arm and the lower arm right here, it seemed to cause me some concern because I wasn't sure how much string tension is going to be exerting itself on that part of the instrument. And it just didn't seem like that joint was going to be very strong. So what I did is I laminated some wood. I have 2 pieces of poly with a piece of ebony. So I have sort of a decorative motif where this strip is visible on the finished instrument, but I also have sort of a reinforcing strip that I brought down the outer edges of the upper arms. And also I put a solid piece of wood here just to kind of shore up that section of the instrument. And also you can see that the lower arms here, I should point out that this is actually going to be hollow when the instrument is finished. I would then add the inner edge and then the back panel on there. Now I wanted to show you this. You can see that I've fit this back piece sort of like a spine on the rear of the instrument at this point. And here are the back panels of the lower arms that I was just talking about. I have the bracing. You have to first determine the position of the bridge before you can lay the bracing on. And so there are 2 pieces of bracing that are actually directly underneath the feet of the bridge, just to support that area of the soundboard. In addition, there's a support here because the tailpiece that is holding the strings is actually going to be anchored at the bottom of the instrument by this piece of wood. You can also notice, I think I should go to the next slide here, the curvature of the back. I don't know if you were able to see that during the performance, but these panels are curved, slightly curved here, and more so here. So I used a bending iron, and if you can imagine that section of a sailboat mast, a metal mast, it's This makes it a little easier to apply. It absorbs more readily into the pores of the wood. So this is a very light finish that was wiped on with a cloth. It does protect the wood to some degree from moisture and soiling and all that. But and then I just have a few more slides here. So that's the back of the instrument. And so here's a little detail of sort of a side view. This is a one-piece bridge. You know, we can debate various aspects of the instrument. It's possible that bridges were not one piece. Maybe they had more than one type of bridge. And here's a view of the tailpiece. This was a bronze rod that I purchased from an industrial supply company, and I just bent it and beat it with a hammer into this shape. There are 3 pieces, and then there's a hole at the bottom of the harp where these pieces are inserted. And then this third piece is just held in place by spring tension. And it's actually not contacting the soundboard, which is hopefully improving the resonance of the instrument, rather than have the tailpiece, as I can see from some reconstructions, physically attached to the soundboard. I wanted to avoid that if possible. This is sort of similar to like a jazz or shop guitar that you might see, the same kind of a tailpiece. And then my last slide wraps up with a few observations. This was the old tuning system that we actually changed last night. I showed up last night at John's house, and John had been experiencing some frustrations with these leather wraps. I mean, literally it was just a piece of leather like this wrapped around the crossbar. And when I first tried this out, it seemed to work pretty well in my shop. It was a little bit hard to get the strings past a certain point, but I think over time there might have been a reaction with the leather and the finish on the crossbar. I don't know, but it just became difficult to turn. So right before I came out to visit, I made some little sticks. Now we've seen depictions, in the Greek iconography where they are using a method similar to this. There might be some kind of hybrid where they use both leather and these sticks. They just give you much more leverage to turn the strings, and they're just wrapped around sort of in a figure-8 pattern on the stick. And you can see here it seems to be working pretty well. And just a few details. John mentioned that some of these harps or kithāras might have had some ivory elements or some precious materials. This is made out of holly wood. It's very white wood. It can be a good ivory substitute if you're going to pinch maybe. So that's what I chose to use there, is to dress it up a little bit. And on my instrument, these pieces here, this is called a buttress, this is a horseshoe, this is a bobbin. That's what some people call these pieces. They're purely decorative. They have no function as far as they don't affect the sound. These little discs on the end of the crossbar, they're also non-functional. Maybe there's some debate whether they affected the tuning or something. I don't see how it's possible. Like I said, I think this crossbar has to be fixed on this slat, and that the tuning has to be done individually on each string. I can't imagine it any other way. So that's about it. I think if I was to make another one, I might experiment with changing a few things. I think overall I would have liked the sound to be a little bolder, maybe a little more volume, and maybe the instrument could be lighter. Some of the aspects of construction might be a little bit heavy. But there are all sorts of possibilities. Maybe if you want to explore, modifying sound in some way, you could experiment with the bridge location, enlarge the surface area of the soundboard, and then, as had been mentioned by 10 or maybe exploring a different method of construction for this area where the upper arm meets the lower arm, and try some kind of design where there's a little bit of flex in the instrument. So that made me curious to look into that as a possibility for altering the sound and maybe finding a little more volume or resonance or attack. So okay, well, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please stop me.
Yes, sir. Feel free without being rude. If anybody has questions for anybody, just ask them. Mark?
I've got a question for any of you. What was that high with back hearing that you say was mentioned in that I sent you? Was that for the bridge part, or was that for?
It's for the tuning collars. What we originally John did with leather initially.
Yeah.
Eustathius is he's a Byzantine commentator, Homer, as you know. He has our most detailed description of this technique from an ancient source, it seems. And he says it's a piece of hide from near the neck of either a bull or a sheep, with some of the fat from beneath the skin still adhering to it to give it some grip. So it seems like it would work pretty well, but it might make a bit of a mess too. And in some of the East African examples, they use these sorts of skin or cloth wraps.
Play something else.
Maybe people can come up and take a rep on it.
How did you decide on the number of strings? Is it not
Well, so the Archaic period, we know they had 7. They eventually settled into a standard of 9 strings. We know that from the names of the strings, the individual names. There's 9 unique strings named, and many of the kitharotic pieces that survive use the range of a 9. So there's been recent research on this aspect of the music fragment. So the 9 strings seem to have become standard by the end of the 5th century. But John put 11 slots into the ordatanos, whatever it's called, the string holder. So if we want to take it up to 11, need that little push to go over the cliff. Phil.
What did you use for strings, and what did they use for strings?
It's funny, I just was asking Tanner that. I think I forgot to mention a note I had about the strings. Like the hide glue, these strings are gut strings made from sheep intestine. And until about 100 years ago, they were the strings that you would find on most stringed instruments, including lutes and violins and that sort of thing. You hardly ever see them anymore. They're very, very expensive. The strings for this instrument cost about $220. The string here, the string with the largest diameter, that alone was about $50. And they're considerably cheaper when you go to the smaller diameters. The smaller diameter strings do tend to break fairly often compared to a moderate string. So you might need to get a few more.
In the Homeric Hermes, it specifies strings of sheep gut, and the epithet is used to face. They're well twisted, so they're multiple strands that are twisted together and are locked. But there's been attempts in other people building these replicas to make homemade gut strings, and it's difficult and messy. But the supplier, John Butterfield, who does it, some gut strings are made, as I understand it, from snips of intestine and are then put into a base that can then hold them, a bit like plywood. But the supplier we got them from actually has machines to twist and process whole strands of intestine. So
You can actually see the strands, especially on the thicker strings. You can see the fibers that twist. They put a twist into it. I don't know a lot about the exact process of manufacturing them, but one thing is they're hygroscopic, and that just means that they're a real headache for musicians because they're very sensitive to temperature and humidity. So if you go from one room to another, or you open the window, or you have to worry about that because they'll go out of tune very quickly. They absorb moisture, and they will change pitch on you quite often.
attributed to Euripides, there are a few extra notes that are interpreted as accompaniment notes. There's a parallel vocal and instrumental notation system, and in this particular piece, the vocal part is notated in one system, and suddenly a few apparently instrumental notes are put in between two phrases, and it looks to be some sort of shorthand, harmonic shorthand for some kind of accompaniment. But that's the only evidence, direct evidence, in the actual fragments of the music notation. We have some secondary references, like the ones I showed you, but further passages that give some hints as to what might have been involved, including one passage that says, with such and such a note, you accompany with such and such another note, and so on. But there's enough evidence to be confident that they did this sort of thing, but not really enough to reconstruct that.
There was presence of a solo instrument or multiple of them together, or other instruments?
Yes, all of those are possible. The solo instrument was sort of the preeminent way to do it in competitions, but for big civic events, you might have massed, maybe dozens even. Also playing with the double pipes. Ryan?
For all three of you, right? Is any construction of looms, did it influence the way you did the crossbar at all, or anything? Or even thinking about lyres? Just looms, kind of weaving and things, and just even the notion of the way the strings move, the hands move across the strings. And
right, there is in poetry, there's quite a lot of comparison between lyre playing and weaving, the idea of going in and out, correcting. But did you look? I don't think
I didn't really look at that. Tanner had drawn the pieces to be constructed in this manner, and I did a little bit of research, and I did look at some images of reconstructions, and some of the reconstructions didn't seem to make much sense to me. This really seems to be a good way to anchor the crossbar, which I feel has to be very rigid. There's also, about this, but I alluded to this notion that these upper arms could have a bit of spring to them or be under some kind of load and actually flex a little bit. There was an idea maybe in some of the research that this crossbar was actually holding these arms with some kind of tension, correct?
Right, so the closer physical analogy, rather than the loom, is the bow, because the names of the parts in Greek are the same for both bow and lyre. So pekes for the arms, zugon for the crossbar, there's the string, of course, and there's the poetic conceit of the lyre as a kind of bow. Pindar talks about discharging melodic arrows and verbal arrows. Apollo does both the lyre and the bow, so they developed that quite a lot. So that analogy would support the idea of the crossbar and the two arms being spring-loaded.
And if there was some kind of spring to the instrument, I think this type of through mortise construction, similar to like a mortise and tenon with furniture, it just makes sense to me. So I didn't, that wasn't an aspect that I thought about too much, because I thought Tanner's instruction seemed perfectly reasonable in regard to this. So it seems quite strong. As I said, that the upper arms have this thicker shoulder. It's hard to see, but they're a little more slender up on the top here. And but that notion of tension, I think, would work with a construction like this also. These are just rigid here as it was made for this instrument here.
Phil?
Could you play, hold it as you probably would, and then play each string in turn? Where's the high note and the low note?
obtuse, sharp was their word for what we say is high pitch, bravos as well. But the string names are something else, a whole different system.
So could you just play each string in turn?
Sure.
That is here.
Maybe since we're running out of time, if anybody wants to come up and examine it, or under somebody's careful